this is the Sabbath, this is a church, and this is the time that we worship our Lord. I want to show you a photograph. This is a photograph of me with my daughter and my father. It was a few years ago now, and actually 14 years ago. Just a few. And we were having a wonderful day together. We'd gone down to San Diego to a museum there. And in the museum, they had this magnificent display of Dead Sea Scrolls. And all three of us really enjoyed it. It was a wonderful day. And somebody took this picture with my phone. You can see how far the technology of cameras in phones has come over 14 years. I didn't know it at the time, but this would be the very last photograph that I and my daughter would ever have with my father. Shortly after he returned to Australia, he was killed in a car accident. And you may have had this experience of being far away from your loved ones and getting that call in the middle of the night, and your brain not fully comprehending the information. And then getting on the plane the next day and flying across the world. And I had the terrible experience of having to identify my father's body. It was awful. And at the time, I felt like Jeremiah. The Bible is not all about, everything being beautiful. It recognizes our sorrows and our struggles. And this is what Jeremiah wrote. Oh, that my head were waters, and my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. I can imagine, just from those words, how he must have been feeling. It'll help a lot to have the right glasses on. For some reason or other, when I was reading this, I was attracted to this expression, a fountain of tears. And it made me think of the book of Revelation, which we have a tendency to think of as a book of prophecies. And it is a book of prophecies. Oh, yes. I think I look better with the mask on. Excuse me. It is a book of prophecy, but it is much more than that. It's a book of hope. And even if we don't understand every detail of every prophecy, there is still great hope in this book. Here in Revelation chapter 7, we read, "For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne," who is that? I see here in this church, they have some symbols up, symbolizing Christ, the Lamb of God. The Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of waters. Oh, there we are. More about fountains of waters. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. What a beautiful thought. I know that everybody here has had cause to shed tears in your lifetime. And yet, here we have our Creator and our Redeemer promising to wipe them away, to remove them forever. Amazing. Fountains of waters, God wiping away the tears from our eyes. This got me thinking, oh, thanks, I actually have a water bottle over here that I'm going to, well, this will do what I think. Yes, I had COVID-19 a month or so ago, and the cough is the lingering after effect. It keeps reminding me that hopefully I'm very immune to it right now, in any case. Of course, as a scientist, it got me thinking about water. Here's a map or a satellite image of the area where I live. And what is very obvious is where there's water, there is life. And where there isn't water, there isn't life. I was actually noticing the topography as we drove here, and how even these small changes in relief here in Cyprus make a difference. I'm assuming that the weather patterns tend to come from one direction or something. And so you see, yes, where you get a little bit more water. Oh, I'm okay. Thank you. Everybody's throwing water at me. It's great. Yeah. Well, don't actually throw it at me. I feel like, yes, I feel like there is a fountain of water here. That's great. So let's talk. It's interesting to me how water is associated with life in the Bible. And it's a very good thing to associate with life because it is a very simple molecule that is a miracle. There are no other molecules that behave in the way that water behaves. It's a good thing that we have it, because without water, it appears that life is impossible. Most of your weight, most of your mass is water. It depends a little bit on various things, but certainly well more than half of your weight is water. And if you take away the water, there can be no life. So let's have a look at this very special molecule a little bit. There's an oxygen, and oxygen loves electrons. Electrons happen to have a negative charge on them. So when oxygen is joined to two hydrogen atoms, the electrons that are supposed to belong to the hydrogen, they're unfaithful to the hydrogen. They spend much more time up there with oxygen. They just like to hang out with oxygen. And so what that leaves behind is a little bit of a positive charge. Now, as you probably know, opposites attract. So while there's a kind of bond called a covalent bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen, there's another kind of weaker bond that forms between water molecules as those positively charged hydrogens are attracted to the negatively charged oxygens in other water molecules. And you can start putting water molecules together, and all of these hydrogen bonds start adding up. This is why a tiny little, very light molecule like water is a liquid at room temperature. Think about things like oxygen in the atmosphere. It's actually 2 oxygen atoms together. Its molecular weight is almost twice what the molecular weight of water is, and yet water sticks together and oxygen is a gas. The same is true of nitrogen. The same is true of the carbon dioxide that you breathe out from your body. Because of this strange weirdness about water, it's a liquid at room temperature. And again, because of this sort of miracle molecule, it does other strange things. When you lower the temperature of water, it becomes more dense until it starts to crystallize. Well, actually, just before that. And when it starts to crystallize into ice, it expands so that ice floats on water. Without that, life would be very difficult on Earth. All of that ice that forms would be sinking to the bottom of the oceans, and the next year, when it cooled down in winter, more ice would sink to the bottom of the ocean, and all of the, many of the great big ecological cycles that go on would not occur. Much of the water would be bound up as ice at the bottom of the ocean. You would still have possibly some liquid water, but not anything like we've got. You wouldn't be able to move heat around the Earth as water does, because that's another kind of weird thing about water. It can hold heat in a way that other molecules cannot. And because of that, we can take hot water from close to the equator and move it up to Northern Europe and make places like Britain and Norway actually habitable and pleasant sometimes. Sometimes. These weird properties of water on a macroscopic scale make life abundant on the face of the Earth. But there's a lot more to it. At the microscopic scale, it also does miraculous things. Because those negative charges can associate with positively charged ions. So if you take salt, which is sodium chloride, the positively charged sodium ion, when it dissolves in water, will associate with the negative charges on the oxygens. On the other hand, the chlorine that's in there forms a chloride ion, and it has a negative charge which can associate with the positive charges in these water molecules. But water can also dissolve other things. Methanol and ethanol and all kinds of proteins and all sorts of other things. Because of this, it's called a universal solvent. There are things that will not dissolve in water, but a huge variety of things can be dissolved in water. And as a consequence of that, we can move things around inside our bodies because our blood is mostly water. And it can take things from one place to another in our blood, not just oxygen. So we concentrate a lot on the way blood carries oxygen from our lungs to our tissues and picks up carbon dioxide and takes it back to our lungs so that we breathe out the carbon dioxide. But it does much, much more. You know that breakfast that you ate this morning? It's being digested here in your stomach and your intestine, and all sorts of little molecules are being absorbed into your bloodstream and distributed throughout your body. This is a truly, truly amazing thing. In addition to that, there are special molecules that your body makes that interact in strange ways with water. Phospholipids are one example. These have a charged molecule on them, the phosphate, and they have an oily molecule on them. And as you probably know, oil doesn't dissolve in water. When you have these special kinds of molecules, if you put a lot of them in, they will automatically arrange themselves in a way in which all of the phosphates are facing outwards because they like to interact with water. And all of those oily tails, they interact with each other because oil likes to dissolve in oil. And this is the secret to how your cells separate their inside from the outside. Because of that, they can maintain different conditions inside than outside themselves. That means they can do something called homeostasis, which means basically maintaining a constant set of conditions inside the cell, even though the outside varies. Because of that, they can have certain chemical reactions that go on inside the cell that simply will not occur outside the cell. All of this is dependent on water and the way it interacts with molecules that your body produces. But that membrane is not just there to keep things separate, because you do need to move things out of cells and you do need to move things into cells. There are all kinds of proteins that interact with the water on the outside, the water on the inside, and that membrane. But I want to draw your attention to this particular molecular machine. And the reason that I'm excited about it, I've been excited about it for a very long time, but just this week, I had the privilege of attending these meetings in Israel with, and one of the speakers was Sir John Walker. You may not have heard of him, but he was given a Nobel Prize for figuring out the structure of this molecular machine on which your life depends. In fact, the vast majority of life depends on this machine. And one of the things that I asked Sir John was, can you make this simpler in some way? Is there some way maybe that it could have evolved? Because it's very complicated. And his reply was very simple. No. You have to have all of these very complex parts working together for this to exist, and life depends on it. That was thrilling, to actually be able to talk with him. But then another professor gave a presentation, and he has been studying the efficiency of this little molecular machine. To put things in perspective, your car with that engine in it, if it's a very, 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 very efficient engine, is operating at approximately 20-something% efficiency. There are a few machines that operate at a slightly higher level. But the efficiency of this machine is 70%. When Professor McDonald said that, any of you who are engineers, your jaw is probably on the ground right now. I know for the rest of you, it's not so impressive. I'm telling you, this is absolutely astonishing efficiency. So I asked Professor McDonald, how much lower could that efficiency be and life still exist? And his response was, none. It has to be this efficient for you to be alive. Just to give you an idea of what this machine does, this machine provides the very special molecular fuel that is used to make all of the chemical reactions that occur inside your cell work. So every time you contract a muscle, it isn't sugar that is being used directly by the muscle fibers. It's something called ATP. And this machine makes ATP. in the average person on an average day, it makes approximately 60 kilograms of ATP. 60 kilograms. I couldn't believe that when I heard it too. Now, what happens is as soon as the ATP is made, it's used up in other chemical reactions. So you don't build up 60 kilograms of ATP, okay? But that's just an astonishing amount of ATP that this machine is making every day for you. And without it, you can't have it. So basically, for this to work, for your body to work, to be alive, requires this amazing molecular machine working at amazing efficiencies. And it must be all at once. There is no evolutionary way of getting to this. It is something that can be engineered. Okay? But engineered by somebody far smarter than you or me or any human engineer. Trust me, if we could do this, we'd be doing it. Yeah. This machine takes advantage of all sorts of weird quantum mechanical tricks and things to do what it does. And during these presentations, this is in a scientific meeting, I almost wanted to shout out, "Amen." I don't know what the reaction would have been, but it was truly astonishing. You remember how I said that science doesn't prove the Bible true? But surely it opens our eyes to truly appreciate what is there in the world and in living things. This is just one little tiny molecular machine, one of many that are found in your body and in everything else that you can see. Literally every other living thing that you can see has this molecular machine in it. Even the bacteria that live in your gut, your zoo that you have down there, they have this molecular machine, and they couldn't survive without it. All of this I don't know, I feel like continuing to preach is kind of pointless. These things are a sermon in and of themselves, but let's continue on. Yeah. When we look at the way, and that machine, I should have made this point, that machine is dependent on the properties of water for it to work. Okay? No water, no ATP synthase, everything's dead. But of course, water allows our circulatory system to circulate. Imagine if your blood was actually dust or diamonds or something. That obviously wouldn't be helpful. But our hearts have different components to them that all work together to pump blood. But it wouldn't be pumpable if it wasn't mostly water. And of course, what this means is that we can have complex gas exchange systems, like those that we find in our lungs, complex systems for the filtering of our blood, the removal of waste products and so on in our kidneys. It allows animals to move heat to different parts of their body. I know it sounds like I'm obsessed with heat, doesn't it? But heat is very, very important. So if you look, for example, at a bird's leg, have you ever seen a bird standing on a frozen pond or something like that, or just swimming in very cold water, and wondered, why doesn't that bird freeze to death? Because I can tell you that if you were standing in that cold, cold water, you would die. I know this from harsh personal experience. I worked on a research project once that required us to be wading in water that was very cold indeed. What we found was that we could only last for a very few minutes, even though we weren't fully immersed in the water. We could only do it for a very few minutes, or we would develop hypothermia and potentially kill ourselves. So it was important to time how long we were in there. And I'm telling you, we were suffering. Birds, not such a big problem, because remember, water carries heat, and they have what we call a counter-current flow system in their legs. So the blood going down exchanges heat with the blood that's coming up. So by the time it gets down to the bottom of the legs, it's not it's cold already, but when it comes back up from the leg, it gets warmed up again before it goes back into the body of the bird. And the consequence of this is they do not lose all of their heat to that cold water. If you've ever wondered about why whales don't freeze to death when they're swimming around up there, way up in the north around Iceland and Greenland and things, why don't they freeze to death, or around Antarctica? That water is cold. They use counter-current flow systems in their fins and in their flukes so that they don't lose all their heat. They're taking advantage of the properties of water, the ability of water to carry heat and transfer it in different ways. Let's take a look at this part of the world. You can see Cyprus on this map. I actually chose this image because it shows all the countries that Jesus lived in, or at least visited. We're pretty certain that he went to Jordan. We know that he spent much of his childhood in Egypt. Obviously, he was in Israel. And we also know that he took trips up into Lebanon. And you can see that this is a region like where I live, where water makes all the difference. The classic example of that is the Nile River. And where the river is, there's water, and there's life. Where the river isn't, there is no life in the desert. So Jesus would have been quite aware of the importance of water. And one day he was walking with the disciples. And apparently they got to the point where they were quite tired. They needed water and they needed food. So Jesus sat down beside a well. And while he was waiting there, hoping probably for somebody to come along who could draw some water out of the well, a lady came. And this was a woman who had everything wrong with her. She was a Samaritan. and Jesus was a Jew. She had had many husbands. She was living in sin with someone, with a man. And she was probably the last person that you would expect Jesus to interact with. So Jesus had this conversation with her. I just want to concentrate on a little bit of it. Jesus answered and said to her, "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water, springing up into eternal life." Now, those of you who are familiar with this story of the woman at the well, you know that she responded in a way that was quite remarkable. Somehow from this, she recognized that Jesus was the Messiah. How? The reason is actually quite simple. She knew her Bible. Yeah. She recognized a sign of the Messiah in what Jesus said. I think she was familiar with the book of Jeremiah, where it says, "O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be ashamed. Those who depart from me shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters." She recognized that when Jesus talked about this fountain of living waters that he was there to give people, she recognized from that he was saying, "I'm God. I'm the Messiah." And probably the thing that astonishes me the most, I mean, there are so many amazing things about this story, but the thing that astonishes me the most is she became the first person to take the gospel to the Gentiles. Okay? Because we know what she did. She immediately went back into the town, spread the good news, and the whole town came out to learn at the feet of Jesus. Now, imagine if she had seen herself as unworthy in some way to do this, or ill-equipped to do it. Or maybe if she had said, "There's only one of me, and that whole town is full of other people who don't know this, so I'm such a minority, I should keep my mouth shut and just sort of creep around, presumably as the sort of wanton woman that she was viewed as." Imagine that. I'm glad she didn't, but there's a huge lesson for us in this. And I've been thinking so much about what Bruno talked about just briefly during the Sabbath school. You know, look at this woman. She's an example really for all of us. You can think of her as being a symbol of this church. It's so nice to all be together, but there are few of us here compared to this big city of Nicosia. Few. But think of what we can do. Think of what we can do. Let's not think about how unqualified we are to share the gospel with other people. Let's think about what God has revealed to us and share it. And let's get behind this thing with Bruno. I mean, it's just amazing. A beautiful, ambitious thing that you're doing, and I pray that God will bless you with this. Now I'm going to shift to a text that may seem odd and out of context. But of course, as I contemplated the death of my father, this is one of those texts that came to mind. This is Paul writing to the Corinthians, and he says, "For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory." I don't know about you, but I'm kind of interested in people who claim that somehow or other the message in the Bible is different in the New Testament than it is in the Old Testament. I don't believe it is. And one of the reasons that it is not different is because of the huge amount of quoting of the Old Testament that we see in the New Testament. Constantly quoting the Old Testament, and this happens to be an example of that. Where did this text come from? Where did this quote that Paul is doing there come from? Death is swallowed up in victory. Well, here it is. It's from Isaiah. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord will... Okay, there's the death being swallowed up, and look at this. You know all that stuff in Revelation about wiping away tears? Here it is in the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is the same as the God in the New Testament. Okay? The same promises are there because this is God we're talking about. The Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. The rebuke of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. Let's look at it in Revelation. Okay. Here is what I consider to be the best news in all the Bible, all sort of summarized into one thing. And yet, sometimes we figure out ways of presenting this as if it's bad news. Okay? This is wonderful news, and so let's read it. Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven. So remember, there's going to be 3 angels giving 3 messages. The first one is our marching orders. Okay? This is God talking to me and talking to this church. He's telling us what we need to do because he is coming soon. So here it is. This angel has the everlasting gospel. This is the big one. If you've ever been confused about what the gospel is, and I certainly have been. I remember when I was a child asking, what is the gospel? And being told, it's the good news. Well, what's the good news? It's the gospel. It wasn't very helpful to me, okay? But here it is. Here it is. It's spelling it out for somebody even as dull as myself, as slow as me. It's spelled out for us. So here is the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation. So that would include Cyprus, wouldn't it? Tribe, tongue, and people. Every one of us. Hey, you know what? There is a reason why this church has English people and Congolese, right? Am I remembering correctly? Yes. And Bulgarians and Russians and Greek Cypriots and Filipinos. And so I'm telling you, everywhere I go in the world, almost, okay, there are rare exceptions, but almost every Christian church that I go into, okay, not just Adventist churches, is like this, okay? There are people from many different backgrounds, many, and yet we come together to worship God because we have heard this everlasting gospel, okay? And so it's being said with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. Now, I think back to my time in boarding school, okay? And there were many very well-meaning people at that boarding school, well-meaning. And we'd have weeks of prayer. And with regularity, we would have people come and tell us the hour of God's judgment is come, and he has reserved lakes of fire for the sinners. And he's going to burn every one of you into smoke that goes up forever if you're not good enough. Frequently, that would be coupled with setting the bar higher and higher and higher and higher for being good enough to not get burned in those lakes of fire. Because, you know, they're warning us, the hour of God's judgment is coming. Sometimes they bang the pulpit to make the point even louder, you know, more emphatically. I don't know, maybe you've heard things like that too. Have you ever thought about what God's judgment is? Because you can't miss it. God's judgment happens to be wiping away every tear. That's God's judgment. God's judgment happens to be a new creation. That's what God's judgment is. Of course, and extraordinarily sadly, those who reject God's grace, those who do not want to be part of this new creation, are not going to be. God is not going to force himself on anybody. But for those of us who accept his grace, who confess our sins, because I don't know about you, but I'll confess to you that I am a terrible sinner. I have any number of evil inclinations. I have not lived a perfect life. And I can tell you that I have not reached the bar that was set for me in high school. Okay? I could confess all sorts of things. I haven't been a perfect vegan. I may have eaten candy on occasion. I mean, really. There are people who think like this. They have not read the Bible. This is good news. It is not bad news. God's judgment is what we yearn for. Don't we want perfect justice? Of course. Of course. Every time we see injustice in the world, when we see a situation like my father, he was on his way to preach at a church when he was killed. Or I think about some of the missionaries who I grew up with. Dr. Helen Morton. Nobody remembers her. It's shocking to me. She died as a martyr. She was murdered in her own home. She died in her kitchen with her throat blown out with a shotgun. Paul Lou. My first memories of living in Penang in Malaysia are of Paul Lou being stoned to death and his body being lit on fire with the gasoline from his motorbike, his scooter. And every day I had to go past that burn mark in the road. And the injustice of that has eaten away at me my entire life. I don't want that to continue. I want God's judgment because I know that God is merciful. I know that God can save those people who did that to Paul Lou. I know that God can save those who murdered Dr. Morton. I know that in the new creation, my Father will be there. He will be happy and healthy, and we will not miss each other. But look at this. Let's read on here. Give God glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, which is a glorious thing, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water. Now, if you look at this expression, springs of water, it is universally in the Bible used as a sign of life-giving, okay? Because water brings life. So, if we look at the way this message is constructed, there is judgment and springs of water. I believe that the reason springs of water is there is to remind us that God brings life. God is not coming to bring death to the world. He is coming again to bring life and life eternal. This is why we're Adventists. This is why we're Seventh-day Adventists. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who is seated on the throne, who is that? This isn't an angel speaking now. This is God himself. He who is seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Because God created in the first place, we can have faith that he can do a new creation. We might look at our world today and see brokenness and suffering and find ourselves weeping over things on occasion. But we can also see that this world is still amazing. There are things like that ATP synthase that I showed you. We could spend, I'm not joking about this, we could spend the rest of this year talking about just that molecular machine and not get to the end of it. It's amazing. God made that in the first place. He can do a new creation. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. So he will wipe every tear from their eyes. That is trustworthy and true. He's making all things new when he comes. That is God's judgment, and I rejoice about that. I'm going to show you another picture. Here I am with my wife and my aunt and my uncle, who happen to be my father's identical twin. And Uncle Cole died 4 years ago now. Not quite 4 years ago. You know, it wasn't the same as losing my own father, but it felt like the last connection was gone. It's nice to have a father who's an identical twin. There were times when I'd be with my uncle and I'd just forget. You know, I'd see him out of the, Dad? Oh, it's you, it's Uncle Cole. But it was nice. It was comforting, and he's gone now. Each one of us can have hope. The hope that we have for ourselves, which we're called to share with our community. Not somewhere else in the world, with our community here in Nicosia, or wherever we live in Cyprus. And so here we are, almost to the end of the Bible, almost to the very end. And in Revelation, someone's speaking again, God. And he says, it's done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. Are you thirsty? I know I am after all this talking. This is what we thirst for. I'm not saying that everybody driving by on that street out there is thirsty. But there are people here, who are thirsty. People who are thirsty for what you have to share as children of God. I'm thrilled at what this endeavor, this adventure that you're launching into. It's a thrilling thing. And I will be praying for its success. I will be praying for you. I wanted to tell you about one other thing, and I know this is kind of bad. I should come, if I was a real pastor, if I was a real preacher, I'd come to a great big crescendo right now, I'd pound my pulpit, and then I'd sit down. But I'm not, I'm a scientist. And I want to tell you about something before I close, and that is that in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we have this special Sabbath that is set aside called Creation Sabbath. This year, it happens to be October 22, okay, which happens to be a very significant date for those of us who are Adventists. We all remember October 22, 1844. Unfortunately, people remember that as a great disappointment. Okay? If October 22, 1844 was the great disappointment, I like to think of Creation Sabbath as the great antidote. Okay? I hope that your church will consider doing something special as part of Creation Sabbath for this year. God bless you as you endeavor to serve the Lord and honor our Creator and Redeemer here in Cyprus. Thank you.